I'm really delighted to be here for this conversation. The intention is to share understanding about what integral theory is, what metamodernism is, particularly as they relate to each other. I'm curious about what relevant similarities and differences there are, and I suppose a way that it would be perhaps most productive to respond to that, what could be a very broad framing, by a real orientation toward what is of mutual relevance between us. There are some places that I'm particularly interested to explore today, but I think we will begin a little bit more broadly, and it'd be nice to share some of these notions with listeners. I am sitting here and looking very much forward to this conversation with Bruce Alderman, who is, in my opinion, very much appears to be an elder of the integral community. I mean that in a very deep sense. I have tremendous appreciation for the conversation we shared as a podcast a few episodes ago. I thoroughly invite listeners to check that out, on the meaning of elderhood. Some really beautiful notions there. I remember one that stood out to me as a field in which time ripens, which I thought was a very nice way of expressing that. And I have tremendous respect for the general breadth, to use perhaps a word that's a bit of a synonym, of your thinking. And so, yeah, one part of the Integral Stage podcast. It's lovely to have you with us. And Brendan, this is the first time we're meeting, but over the last few years, I've noticed you consistently publish some very clear and astute work in relation to metamodernism. Of course, you're the author of the book Emergentism, and I can't remember the subtitle precisely, but that's the core of the position that you've articulated. And by my perspective, you become very well regarded as a articulator of metamodernism and what metamodernism is. And I'm really curious, really, to inquire this of both of you. You know, perhaps we'll begin with yourself, Brendan, if we can, and to just maybe ask you to articulate why metamodernism is interesting at all. Like, what is it? Can we call it a worldview? How has it come to prominence or interest in your life? What way can we consider it to be something which is genuinely helpful in making sense of and addressing questions and the moment of our time?
Yeah, wow, that's a set of big questions. And first, thank you so much, Tim, for doing this. This is great. I really appreciate the opportunity. Bruce, great to see you. Great to chat again with you. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to this. Yeah, right. I guess a brief attempt at trying to answer some of those questions is metamodernism is a word for talking about what comes after postmodernism. And if we think about, I guess, a lot of the limitations of where we've been in the kind of postmodern moment, and then before that, the limitations of modernity, and we try to think about what affordances a postmodern, a metamodern approach could offer. I think that's kind of maybe a way of looking at the issue, and there it's sort of the issue of a meaning crisis, I think, lands for a lot of people as a helpful frame for this, and appreciating the postmodern moment as being sort of rife with skepticism, cynicism, nihilism, and responding to the situation and the kind of precepts of modernity with a kind of a set of ideas that in some ways advance the conversation and the dialectic, but in other ways also lead to certain impasses and kind of stuckness or a stymied reality. And I think that right now we're really coming up against that in a huge way, that a lot of people are feeling in their lives around issues of meaning, issues of purpose, but also issues of sustainability and the broader kind of set of crises that we're facing collectively. So metamodernism is a kind of cluster of ideas, a cluster of different discourses that are all kind of working with that general term to try to think about what comes on the other side of all that. How do we re-engage issues of meaning and purpose and value? How do we create new societal structures and social organizational systems that can be, that can aid the flourishing of humanity? And so I come at this very much through the lens of spirituality and sort of meaning making, and that's where I think that there's a lot of value to be gained from this. But obviously, a very hard thing to kind of quickly summarize. But you can also, I think maybe people who are familiar with the integral paradigm are going to see a lot of similarities there, obviously set up in the sense that there's looking towards something beyond the postmodern, and also, then within some of the metamodern conversation, there have been discourses that are particularly influenced by integral theory, the work of Ken Wilber. And so there's been a lot of overlap, and also overlap and not. And that's sort of part of what needs to, I think, be teased out a little bit in some of the conversations around, like, well, what are the differences? What are the similarities and whatnot between these different kind of paradigm. So that would be a brief kind of introduction to the idea. I came to Metamodernism back in 2013 or so, and it was only some years after that then the Hansi Freinacht work kind of showed up on the scene, and that kind of plugged Metamodernism into an integral conversation. And then Jason Storm's work showed up a couple years after that, and the work of Lena Rachel Anderson and others, Thomas Bjorkman. So it's become this sort of very dynamic conversation that has deep integral influences on some parts of it, of the conversation, and then other parts of the conversation are doing something very different, but they're all in a shared kind of conversation space around talking about what comes after postmodernism, looking at the cultural reality that we're in and where we're headed, and looking for a certain kind of way to make sense of what we're seeing in a way that is no longer postmodern and something very different, and yet seems to be kind of moving beyond it, and yet also retaining or bringing back certain things from prior cultural codes and cultural logics. So I find all of that to be deeply fascinating, deeply important, really, really helpful for a host of reasons that we'll probably get into. But that's my kind of 5 cent, answer up front.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you for that. Thank you. It is a very difficult thing to... It's a very difficult thing to synthesize, or at least it is for me, partly when it seems to me what's at stake when we're speaking about paradigms of thinking such as metamodernism, integral. At the very least, we're thinking about truth and our relation to it. You mentioned spirituality and meaning making. Now, it's for sure the case that for many people influenced by this tradition, or that we could give them different names, but the relationship between the meaning in life and truth as such can become very disjunctive, can become painful, we can become nihilistic. We might believe we can know some dull truths about things, but in that context, believe very rigidly that there's no place for any possibility of affirming life. That's a wild thing, and it does seem to me that at least one profound commonality then is that there is really central to both paradigms, and I don't want to say too much here, and I'll pass this over to yourself, Bruce. Central to both is a real care for affirming the total reality of the human experience within the worldview, within a worldview that is also seeking to relate in a mature and active way with the process of real truth seeking, an integrous way with truth seeking. And it's kind of bizarre in some sense that such things could ever come apart, at least to my mind. I understand it for some historical reasons. But how about that then, Bruce? I'm curious what you think of that, and also how you would sort of open up the notion of integral theory to those who maybe might be encountering it, maybe first time. I don't mean to ask too much there, but certainly I anticipate everyone listening to this is interested in, uh, making sense of their lives, making sense of the world, and can in this moment feel into their present reality and very much affirm the truth of that, whatever that means, right? And so, in some important sense, well, I'd like to speak to that in some way, to really ground it in the present. So what is integral theory in that regard? And if you'd like to respond to anything either one of us has said by way of weaving in, that would be welcome too.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for also the very warm welcome at the beginning. I'm happy to be here with both of you. And yeah, Brendan is right in that some of the description I would also want to use for integral. And I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting tension and fruitful contact point that I think, and that's part of the tension that was emerging offline off of this meeting is what brought us together. So in terms of the meeting of worldviews and perspectives on reality, and I think shared things that we have a lot of passion and interest in. So I really like to open that up a little bit and explore skillful relating among, I think, a fine, kindred movements and sensibilities for for unfolding that fullness of our human experience that you were pointing to, and an awakening or tapping into the fullness of that, the potential that we have to meet the complexity of the challenges that are at our doorstep right now. I think a lot of people really feel pressed by something larger than the worldview that's common can accommodate. And that in itself can be trauma inducing and create dissociative responses and reactive responses. And, so there's an interest in moving into a way of being that is better able to navigate the complexity of what's confronting us right now. About, the integral movement, I mean, for, that is one of the descriptions that we would also put to it, is that integral has been imagined to be what follows postmodernism in terms of a general orientation and sensibility. I would say integral is not yet a worldview. It's a worldview wanting to be born. It's not a broad emergent cultural sensibility yet. So I think there's a difference between metamodernism and integral in that regard, at least on the side of the cultural and aesthetic metamodernism. There have been people who've been tracking culturally the emergence of a shift in sensibility. And that is a descriptive project. It's not a prescriptive project. It's noting there's a shift in a structure of feeling, a way of orienting that people have been describing. So that was, one of the earliest things that began to bear that metamodern label. For an integral approach, it's, integral studies encompasses the approaches of multiple people. I generally focus most on Ken Wilber's work, but there's Aurobindo, who, created an integral yoga, looking to synthesize all the different schools of Indian yogic traditions in a comprehensive approach that could really say yes to the multiple different styles of working with self and reality, acknowledging that each one of them bore some kind of truth, some kind of fruitfulness, some kind of generativity to them, and that it made sense culturally and individually to say yes to all of them and to see what can then emerge interstitially among the embrace of all of those different yogic paths. Right? And for Gene Gebser, he was feeling what he calls the kind of the modern mental sensibility, kind of the propositional thinking oriented, perspectival orientation of modernity, which is associated with certain cultural art forms and feelings and modes of expression and patterns of thinking. And he was feeling that, in our modern era, he's writing, a number of decades back, we were reaching some dead ends, some uh, uh, less functional applications and expressions of the mental mode. And we were coming up against those deficiencies, the deficient mental mode, and something new was wanting to emerge. He was really writing before the emergence of postmodernism. So what he saw is partly, overlapping with postmodernism and partly with what we would call, integral thought nowadays. But on Ken Wilber's side, he started out really in the area of psychology and transpersonal psychology. And it was a personal, individual project first, where he was receiving a lot of benefit from various psychological methods and approaches in navigating his own self-exploration, and benefiting from Zen practice and from Eastern contemplative traditions, and seeing that a lot of these schools, dismissed each other. And yet for him, he was finding all of them relevant in different ways. And so he wanted to make room, and he did that through a stacking procedure initially, to see, conceiving of consciousness as having a spectrum and different psychological and spiritual approaches addressing different layers of that spectrum. So that was his initial project, and he got involved in transpersonal psychology for many years. But in following that path and in wrestling with a lot of the critiques that came his way, from science, from the humanities, from various postmodern movements, it really made him need to confront broader social movements and knowledge disciplines. And so that gradually moved him towards the articulation of what became the Wilberian integral approach, and digesting the work of many other people to help him realize that it's called integral in one sense because there seems to be a type of an emergent self-awareness that's able to see at work in oneself different value systems that relate to different periods of history and different stages of also individual development. And there's some correlation between those. And the integral stance is to say yes to all of those, rather than position itself definitionally against those. A lot of, emergent cultural movements stake their ground by positioning themselves against what came before. And part of the integrative impulse is to see value and actually constructive, fruitful contribution of each of those approaches to what is sensed as the emergent self-structure and mode of meaning making. And so there's a move towards a wanting to embrace and work fruitfully with those things in different ways, and to situate yourself in the middle of that. But the point I was making, and I want to go on too much, the point I was making about the prescriptive and descriptive, mostly integral unfolded as the work of an individual writing some books and theorizing about culture and psychology. And there were fans, right? Sometime in the early 2000s, a decision was made, partly because a large amount of money was offered to him to get something moving to help integral thought move into, culture in a number of different ways. And so there was a pivot that happened where there was a deliberate attempt at culture building. I think it's had some impact. There are small bubbles, but it's not something that's really gone out into the culture. So I think there is a difference between, whatever is happening culturally that people are pointing at as metamodern. It's not happening self-consciously by many people saying, I want to make metamodern art. It's something that's emerging as part of our time, right? Integral thought, I think, at least recognize that this kind of development is happening, that this ability to accommodate kind of the fuller richness of human history and potential is emergent, but there was no integral culture per se. There's no place that you can point where it's spontaneously emergent as identified integral, right? So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful. It's a few thoughts in the pot here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Well, there's just so many things. There's so many things to talk about.
No, I think we're done, actually. I think that summed it up. No, it's good.
All right, I'm off. Well,
thanks everyone.
yeah. So I will just share this thought. I was giving it some time to see if it would recede. I'm like, are you going to share it? I'm going to share it. It seems to be the case that once just about anything is labeled, and should that be catchy enough, should enough people be attracted to it for whatever reason, can start to become mimetic structure, language, game. You know, I'm not trying to be too cynical necessarily here, but certainly there's a difference perhaps between feeling a current and being oriented to create or to move by virtue of participating with that current. You might imagine some artists doing that. And then perhaps going some way along that path or a different one entirely, encountering some others who are referring to their interests and their friends and as either metamodern or integral. And in such instances, we have a kind of selection process going on, and sort of niches begin to form, social niches, and all of a sudden, I wonder how much. It is curious, isn't it? I wonder how much, or what the difference is really, or what the dynamics are between that notion you spoke to, Bruce, of the artist, let's say, that's feeling something in the territory and responding to that or having it come through them, and then some established mimetic structure that might attract people. You mentioned money in the case of the Integral Institute and what have you, these different types of resourcing and orienting and structure enabling processes which might create some context which then becomes that which propagates integral or propagates metamodernism. I'm not trying to say this is what's happened in any way. I'm not trying to make that point. I'm just trying to identify that there can become a little bit of difference just in relation to those types of phenomena. So, and then on the one hand, we have this, let's say, maybe the remembering what it's like to be that fish or creature in the water feeling the current and in a very real sense kind of being oxygenated by it, breathing it through as their very kind of enabling life force, as a kind of, that's a kind of profound acquaintance with an unfolding of reality. And then there's also this social process, particularly in the world of science and what have you, and just into subjective processes like, well, how are we going to coordinate together about some consistency of terminology, and are we seeing the same things, the truth out there? Can we calibrate the objective? There's these other type of processes that need to take place in that sense as a kind of collective collaboration. And in some ways that's just coming through to me as a core dynamic. Of course, in integral you have the interior, the exterior, you have the first person and the collective. Yeah, I'm just curious in whatever way that might be relevant. Perhaps I'll pass it over to you, Brendan. Do you feel in yourself at times any tension between your relationship as a seeker, let's say, and a knower of your own being as it evolves, unfolds, however we want to say that, and then this process that we engage in, which attempts to, for very important reasons, seek to enter into discourse and participate in the organization and sometimes appropriate kinds of competition to clarify and coordinate thinking about very real problems in the world, not least big collective problems. We have to share language and all this stuff, and we're so interdependent and all the rest of it. Do you feel that kind of tension in your own work?
not sure if I'd call it attention so much. I think that's just how it all works. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
we look out at the world and we try to make sense of it, and we come up with terms and frameworks and models and theories. And then we compare notes with other people. And if they're finding similar things, then that's sort of like, oh, okay, we're on the right track here. And then we start to slowly kind of through reflection, objectify certain things that are out there and reify them. And then we can kind of take them as objects of thought. And then we can sort of also then that allows us, I would say, to go through to the next step of our individual development. Because then once you have that as an object of thought, you can kind of work with it, you can kind of dance with it, and then you can see where it fails, see what its strengths and its weaknesses are, and then kind of try to get on the other side of it. And then this process is iterative and recursive, and it kind of continues. And so this is kind of what I lay out in my presentation of the idea of metamodernism is this is how the whole thing kind of keeps going and unfolding. This is the dynamics of personal growth. It's the dynamics of cultural evolution and development. And so yeah, I don't see that so much as attention as just sort of these are the mechanics of how we make sense of the world and kind of climb the ladder of ourselves, you know, but it's a process of looking at the world, making sense of it, and doing all of that. So I think it's sort of kind of necessary. And I think that there's a danger in maybe getting too, how would you say, like getting too caught up in the any given sort of paradigm that comes out of that process, right? Because like this is one of the things that I find really exciting about both to some degree integral and metamodern approaches is that there's a kind of self-awareness of the fact of the dynamics themselves that then gives you a kind of meta position on the whole thing so that you can anticipate that what you are currently working with will itself be transcended in turn. And so I think that that's a nice sort of safety valve, you know, against kind of various forms of totalitarian or totalizing thought, right? Of like, oh, we have the answer now, right? Because built into the whole model is this sense that like, nope, this is how this kind of dialectic unfolds, and we get a sense of it, and then we stand back from it, we see it, and then we have a new perspective, and now we can take a perspective on that perspective, and so on and so forth. So that's been very kind of liberating, I guess, in that sense too, because there's not the quest per se for the ultimate answer. It's sort of the provisional next step. It's the, you know, adjacent possible. It's what can come next. And so I do think that both integral and metamodern conversations have been kind of engaged in that process. And there have been aspects in which there's a lot of overlap in terms of both identifying that process and then thinking about, you know, where we're at in that process, basically. But yeah, in terms of the tension aspect, no, I think it becomes a tension when you start outwearing the paradigm, right? When you're trying to work with a model that it doesn't work anymore, right? And so I think that the tension happens when we're working with things that are sort of like they've outgrown their usefulness. And every model, every framework, every theory will outgrow its usefulness at some point, right? And best are the models that have that built into the models themselves, so they kind of expect and intuit their own transcendence. So yeah, I think that's sort of that can be the growth edge, is sort of like when and how do we incorporate new ideas into our models, or even see that structurally there's certain profound limitations in them, and then try to find something else and kind of, you know, be a snake sloughing its skin sort of a thing. But in terms of the actual kind of fundamental dynamics, I think once you see them, they're sort of like, I don't know, it's almost liberatory in some way.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, yeah, there's a lot in there I think would be interesting to respond to, but to turn it over to yourself, Bruce. One of the things Brendan's mentioned there is that you can, you know, see a notion of tension in the context of whether a paradigm or some, let's call it a paradigm or set of ideas sort of becomes less useful, is no longer as fit. And if you're trying to hold on or what have you, it can become in that way enclosing and would not be liberating. And so I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious, because in the case of integral theory, you have something which, in some sense, by definition, is wanting always to avail itself to include, remain appropriately open to any sort of domain of understanding or insight that might have been overlooked in this way, but actually, how can we bring that in and relate with it? I'm curious about how you relate to metamodernism as well, both metamodernism and integral from that perspective. In what ways, why is there difference here at all, really? It seems like to me now might be an interesting time to hear your perspective on that, because there's a lot of openness. There's this sense, I think, that, and Brendan's just outlined, I think we'd all share, which is wanting to remain open to real inquiry with the world fundamentally. And yet, there have been interesting branch points. All of a sudden, we have a meme like Metamodernism and a meme like Integral. I'm curious about what may be missed here or missed there. Why have things become two? I mean, that's so basic. But why do you think we're here inquiring about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. In one sense, I feel let 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean, that's been my own orientation for a long time is, I think whatever is confronting us culturally and as a species, wherever we are in these complex times with many, many overlapping horizons of meaning and senses of temporality and different kinds of existential pressures, no one approach is going to be adequate to responding to all of that. And it doesn't make sense to try to hold on or put forward the single all-encompassing sphere that I am going to subsume within my project or within this movement, within this set of terminology, all of these things and be the answer for everybody. Right? I think, I resonate a lot with Raimon Panikar's work or with Sloterdijk. Sloterdijk talks about the modernist impulse to fold everything within this containing womb. But the womb can't be stretched beyond a certain point. Eventually it ruptures, right? And, a lot of the empire building, global movement, colonialist kind of projects, they failed. They tried to inflate the womb too large, right? And he points instead to foam, to these emergent bubbles that are contiguous and that overlap and that have a lot of, conviviality, and that they work together in a new way, in a different way, than the all-encompassing sphere or globe. So from that sense, from that point of view, there's no issue at all between there being an integral movement or a metamodern movement or many, many other things. There's many others. One of the things that we've wanted to do with the Integral Stage as a podcast is to basically hold open a room for the meeting of multiple different kinds of sense-making, meaning-making practice, communities and movements to intersect and to interface and to dialogue and to generate something new without an interest in any one of those things being subsumed into a single master narrative, right? So I think instead we do want to look for what runs in common through many of the different approaches and to work with those things and to, speaking of a group to which Brendan and I both belong, identify arches that connect different kinds of movements. And, it's an integrated pluralist kind of approach. So, from that perspective, there's not a tension, right? I think, where there's been, if you observe, social media, and there's been some back and forth between the integral and the metamodern and this and that. And some of it's been playful fun and some of it's been serious. But I think, one of the, from my side, one of my feelings there is that I've been involved in doing these kinds of projects for many decades. And I'm seeing new projects start up, and they're kind of like doing all the same things that we've already done for a couple decades, and like to contribute to the conversation, say, hey, have you looked at this, or this has been done, or maybe there's a limitation if you approach it this way because we've already tried that for a couple decades and it didn't work, that kind of thing. And so there's a desire for there to be that kind of dialogue and sharing of experience that I don't feel is always accommodated or always welcome. So I think there's been some tension around that that I've experienced.
Yeah, I get that. Well, here's a way to put this. So, for many reasons, a son may want, some families, they stick together, certainly more than mine did when I was young. But the son wants to build a house a little bit differently, a little bit further away from his father's house, not the same one. And maybe he can learn a lot from him. And by the way, I'm not trying to say that Metamodernism is the son or anything of integral theory. If you just bear with me for that, there can be dispute about these things. And I know there are some different historical aspects to this. I'm more trying to point to that even in a case where there might be as much similarity as a shared commons of land and family, right? And the farm you might both care for, the land you want to live in, sons like to differentiate from fathers. This happens. And sometimes it can be done just out of that desire to, I want to be a bit different. I want to do it just a bit differently. And maybe I don't want to hear from you. I don't want to hear from what's been done before. And sometimes that's for it's a very helpful impulse. Sometimes it's not. And I'm curious, or at least sometimes there's something that really ought to be learned. So I'm curious in what sense, Bruce, you might feel, are there particular areas of inquiry within integral theory, and you kind of talking about almost a sort of, experimental cultural praxis here as something which is advice that can be given or experience that can be shared. And I'm interested in that for sure. There's a lot of important stuff there when it comes to social dynamics and different structures of leadership and treatment of people and what have you. But also areas of inquiry. And I'm curious particularly, for instance, about the subtleties of the subtle realm of conscious experience, of subjectivity, of what can be not only esoteric practice, but very, very difficult to coordinate among large groups of people. I mean, hence esoteric in some sense. Structures of experience, dynamics of experience, which might reveal or could reveal a certain nature of reality, which could be in tremendous tension with certainly modernist empirical study that's really only concerned with what instruments of measurement can get at in the external world. It's obviously tremendously tricky to approach the uniqueness of subjective experience. You can't apply all of the same tools, and yet the intimacy of that as a lived process is, well, profoundly real. Now, what is claimed in terms of what the contents of such experiences imply about existence, I mean, there's a lot of differentiation in language that needs to be made here. I'm trying to introduce a few things at once. I'm curious about if there are, I mean, there's one sort of branch point here which looks at what the sort of praxis of maybe cultural building or social experimentation in attempt to respond to world dynamics looks like in terms of what's been tried before and what might be sort of something slightly newer in relation. And then there's also, I'm curious about, are there areas of inquiry? Are there, in that sense, dynamics of experience? Are there truth claims and in claims of relevance and importance that are made in the context of integral as you see it, which aren't treated in the same way or with the same level of importance in metamodernism, and vice versa as well, Brendan? That's, I'm trying to frame, see what I'm trying to get at here?
That was for Bruce, yes.
Well, yes, but certainly opening it. I just leave it to the silence, and I think Bruce is contemplating there.
Yeah, I was feeling into it, but open for Brendan if you want to share anything too. And I think certainly there are differences in certain truth claims, and I think in a sense that's again also not an issue or a problem. It's an area of negotiation. It's certainly not a problem that a different community would come to some different conclusions around truth than another community would, or another body of thought. But there's, if there are different conclusions, that those can be very interesting points of contact. My general sensibility is, you give any individual, even implicitly, but over time, any group will over time kind of holographically, implicitly enfold patterns and potentials of the other groups, that there's going to be some kind of fractal duplication in that sense, but it's not going to be an identity. And there are going to be different emphases. There's going to be different lines of flight that groups follow for one reason or another. And, even though I would regard, us as enfolding a lot of the same implicit potential and patterns and dynamics, there's really powerful grounds for meeting around those differences. And I think that, there's those differences are actually connective. They will, they're mutually informing when engaged. And so I think, one thing that's really valuable to me as a praxis is just that kind of work with people from different backgrounds and different sets of assumptions, using again a Panikar term, but following the imperative method. The imperative method being a form of encounter with difference that allows you to be penetrated by the difference in a way that involves a risk of internal rupture, reorganization, and transformation. And at the same time, being integrous about one's own boundaries and one's own beliefs, and not, some kind of moving into some kind of codependent or other kinds of merging dynamics that are not healthy. But I think there can be interculturally, intercommunally, those kinds of practices which are vital for our time. And so sometimes I see commentators from the outside, if they're watching some kind of sparring going on between integral and metamodern, or integral and game B, or metamodern and something else, if these groups can't communicate, who do we look to, right? And of course, that's partly just, poking for fun. But to me, I think there is something serious in that I think aspirationally, I think that is something that both communities value, is the ability to interface creatively and generatively with difference, in a way that recognizes, this is even coming from postmodernism, but I think it can deepen in metamodern or integral registers, that, that encounter with difference is generally enriching. And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm really getting to what you were pointing at, Tim, but yeah.
Well, can I feel like, yeah, we've kind of been talking around a lot of things, but I feel like we can just dive into some very specific instances too. Like that would be very rich to just be like, oh, here's some meaningful differences between these different things. So that might be one kind of avenue to take. And because yeah, I think that at the meta level, Bruce and I are, we're friends, and Bruce has been to the, Metamodern retreats here, and we're part of the same organizations and stuff. I think the conversation really just hinges on certain differences in orientation, meta-theoretical formulations, strategic approaches, this sort of a thing. And it's, I think sensibility-wise, there's a lot of shared common ground there. So my sense, and I'd love to get Bruce's thought on all this, is just sort of like, this is how I would frame some of the distinctions, is like, one, metamodernism is kind of a term that's capturing a bunch of different conversations that are relatively recent. I list the Tim Vermeulen, Robin von Doniker cultural studies metamodernism as like one pillar. Then you've got the Hansi Freinacht pillar, which is where a lot of the integral stuff comes in. Then you've got kind of Jason Storm's stuff, who's doing kind of systematic philosophy in a postmodern register. And there's a lot of overlap there. And that is, so it creates this very rich conversation space. And so you've got integral roots and infusions in there, but then you've got also people who aren't engaging with integral ideas at all, or development, or any of that stuff. So it's a very kind of internally diverse conversation, but it has a lot of overlap with integral ideas as well. And so that's a meaningful difference. It's a different set of lineages, but within the similarities, and I'm deeply influenced and attracted to the integral paradigm, and the whole integral discourse, I think, has been incredibly enriching for me. Within that, it led to some conversations around people conflating metamodernism with integral theory. And there was a lot of that going on in the space for a while. So part of my recent work that I've been trying to do, and part of the conversations that generated this conversation, have been around, I think, trying to disentangle the two, trying to be like, well, how is this different? And what are the meaningful differences? And when you do that, then one, you have to name what I just named, which is that some elements of metamodernism aren't integral in any way, right? But might be approached from an integral lens, you could say. Integral informed people could look at what's happening in culture and say, oh, but look, this actually makes a lot of sense in terms of integral theory, and that makes a lot of sense to do that. But then there is also a particular strand of metamodern discourse that is very influenced by integral theory and the same kinds of developmental models and the same kind of cultural evolutionary framework, but it does something very different. So part of what's been going on, I think, in the conversation between metamodern and integral is being like, okay, wait a second. Some people want to just conflate metamodernism with integral theory. And it's like, no, we need to not do that, and here's why. And then other people are like, absolutely no connection between metamodernism and integral, and then we have to explain why there actually is, right? So there's multiple angles to that. So I think when you're engaged in the disentangling conversation, which is what I've been trying to do a little bit, both descriptively and prescriptively. In the descriptive sense, I've just been trying to say, here's what Hansi Freinacht has said in his book, for example, to try to explain like what that metamodernism that both has an integral flavor to it is saying, that's yet different from integral. But also I'm trying to synthesize a lot of these different schools of thought and then provide a kind of meta-analysis to say, well, here's what I think this all looks like. And to be fair, I think that there's a lot of what I'm saying in that synthetic approach that looks a lot like integral theory, which is talking about recursive reflection and these sorts of patterns that you find in developmental psychology. So there's a lot of intertwining there. And I think that part of the most fervent sort of stuff that's come up recently, a lot of the foment, has been in naming some of the ways that metamodernism does have meaningful, departures from the integral approach. And so one of them, for example, is around the developmental theory models. And it depends on how, into the weeds we want to go on all this sort of stuff. But broadly speaking, in the metamodernism that I see and that I personally sort of resonate with, there is a reticence towards the kind of stage stacking and the kind of like presenting models that lead into, very high level stages of consciousness and whatnot, and trying to make certain kinds of cultural evolutionary claims based on that. Metamodernism takes a different tack and kind of a critique even of the integral model. And it's like, well, wait a second, how empirically grounded are these models? And like, what are we really working with here? And so it kind of puts a sort of like a more kind of cautious, hesitant, conservative approach to kind of using developmental models in anticipating the future of human evolution. Now, well, I want to get ahead of myself and say all the ways in which integral could be providing some really valuable things about gesturing towards where we are ultimately going. But there is also this impulse in the metamodern conversation to just focus more or less on where we're at. And again, that kind of next adjacent possible step. So there is an emphasis in the metamodern conversations that are specifically developmental to kind of focus on more immediate developmental stages. And also to try to ground these empirically in a more robust way. And so there is a deep kind of critique that I've personally been experiencing and I've seen emerging in other places of kind of Wilber's model that needs to be reworked. And to Bruce's point, and I give the integral crowd a lot of credit over the past 10, 15, 20 years. Or if I haven't, then I'm doing so, very publicly right now. Like, this stuff has been talked about for a long time. There's integral journals, the integral review, there's all this stuff and people, expanding the theory and challenging it and doing all this kind of important work. Bruce has been a big part of this. And so I think Bruce is right to kind of be like, wait a second, aren't we kind of treading old water here? Like, we've been saying all this stuff for 15 years. And I think the metamodernists are sort of like, yeah, but like, where is this all collected? Because if you want to talk about integral theory, most people are going to be like, oh, go read Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, go read Wilber's books, right? But like, there's so much that's happened in the world of developmental psychology and different advances in complexity theory and all these things that have emerged over the past 20 years that just aren't in a work, right, that you can point to and be like, so if you're in an integral community reading integral, papers in integral journals, yeah, then maybe you're hip to all this stuff, right? But I think one of the advances of metamodern theory in the Hansi Freinock Developmental Register has been just like, here's a book that tries to distill some of the more recent ideas about these things and present a new model that we can work around. And so that I think has been a meaningful way in which, these communities are grappling with each other. And so I want to name all those stuff. And again, we're getting kind of into the details here, but I think this is really important because broad strokes, Bruce and I mostly agree on all this stuff. I think, I'm happy to disagree if that's not the case, but I think it's more just sort of like, we're trying to grapple with the nitty gritty here, and we're trying to work with these models in the most effective and honest way and everything. So anyway, I'll shut up for a minute, but I'd love to hear Bruce's response to that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, I think actually in a way you kind of beautifully folded into your explanation there, your explication there, any of the kind of critique or pushback that was happening, and you've kind of just like folded it in a nice way that I really appreciate. I think some of the foment that happened, over the last, several weeks was, again, I think a feeling of there not being that recognition of the connection to integral that really was there for important parts of metamodernism, and a question about why that was obscured. And, I understood that, part of that was for academic credibility. We want to make headway in certain regards, and it's opening up a little bit of a can of worms to make the connection of aspects of metamodernism to integral theory a little bit too clear or too close. It might be, undermining to the overall project. At least that's kind of how I read some of the, initial responses to the questioning about why there wasn't an inclusion of the influence of Wilber on Hansi in your recent book, when that's a significant influence. And you're doing a revision on the book to make sure that that's clear, and all of that. So there really, to me, isn't a significant tension point, but that was kind of the source of that. Was there has been this long dialogue, and a lot of things in journals, a lot of the reflection on these things. Otto Lasky's work around development, integrating integral and critical realist perspectives on human and adult development. A lot of the work that Zach Stein has written, he wrote in and for integral conferences that we all took very seriously, and the whole Lectica critique. Suzanne Cook-Greuter has some aspects that are strong, some that are not as strong, but she's been consistently both a contributor to and a critic of integral in terms of some of its excesses, and that's been part of the dialogue. And so, yeah, it is true that there are, I think, integral theory has been around a longer time. And I think, for integral theory, if you look for scholarly articles, you'll find about 18 to 20,000 of those published academic journal articles referencing integral theory, whereas you'll find 3,000 or 4,000 for metamodern. So it's a lot easier to distill what's happening for metamodernism right now, because it still is relatively new and relatively small, and it hasn't, been mulled over and worked with in the same ways, for as long a period of time. That will definitely change. I think pointing only to Wilber is definitely problematic in terms of, what is valuable and valid integral thinking, especially to understand, what's going on in that arena in the past 15 years. There's definitely been a lot, in adjacent contexts and in what we call the integral diasporic movement, a lot of people who were influenced and now unfolding lines of thought in various ways. But yeah, I think, in terms of the overall interest or strategy on the side of metamodernism, I think, yeah, Hansi's Death to Turquoise is cheeky and it's fun. And I don't think there's any issue. I like that in some way. I do think that there's room for turquoise, and that, but overall, a general conservatism around that, and an interest in empirical grounding, an interest in really looking carefully at how these things are theorized, what support there is for them, and how they're culturally deployed. I think there's a lot of problems that, that this particular community has, suffered from a loose or immature deployment of, high-level stage theorization that's not well grounded, and it leads to a lot of different kinds of, issues, which I think people rightly recoil from and say, if we want to move forward in a thoughtful way, we need to do certain things. So, yeah, all of that discourse, though, has been present within generally the integral community, and, as serious points of concern and interest. Yeah, and, so I don't know that there's really any disagreement there. It's just one of the things that was, I guess for me, being somebody who teaches integral in an academy, and I've taught it in a couple schools, but the idea that to touch integral theory is academic suicide, or it doesn't fly in the academy. I found that that's not the case. There are 45 universities that I personally know of that teach integral content and have integrally themed courses or programs. There are 3 or 4 universities, 5 maybe, that are organized, have whole programs specifically organized around it. But Stanford, University of Virginia, University of Oslo, all over the place, there are integral courses and projects within the academy. And so part of the kind of the push back also was around that narrative that was emerging, is that integral needs to be sidelined entirely in order to have academic credibility and viability. And, I think my experience in those areas, while recognizing the excesses that do cause problems, I thought that was overstated. And so that's where one area I was pushing back on.
Yeah. And those are all very, good points that I'd like to, just briefly touch on and echo in some ways and also respond to. I think Benita Roy, right? Did she coin integral diaspora? Was that her coinage I personally see a lot of the contemporary metamodern conversation as being an outgrowth directly of the integral diaspora. It's sort of like, in some ways, there's no, it's the same thing. In a really significant way, I think, Hansi Freinach's book is you could class that under that general umbrella. It's coming from the tradition, responding to it, criticizing it, and trying to do something different, but also something similar. Also it's important to appreciate the context of, I think, what generated some of this conversation, which is and this, I don't know what the right word is, because it's not quite a disagreement or a kerfuffle. It's just sort of it's a thing, but is the book that I was writing, which was trying to synthesize these different forms of metamodernism. And I just wanted to speak to that briefly too, because part of what you're naming is important in relation to that, because we do have different experiences around how people, both in academia and not, respond to the integral brand, so to speak, right? And so coming into the metamodern conversation, there were some voices that were just very vocal against Ken Wilber, and multiple strands of the discourse. The cultural studies folks were like, this has nothing to do with Ken Wilber. Lena Rachel Anderson's been very publicly vocal about, this has nothing to do with Ken Wilber, and I want nothing to do with Ken Wilber, even though there's a lot of, conceptual overlap there, right? And so trying to synthesize a discourse that is, on the one hand, some people are saying, this is all just Ken Wilber, and other people are like, this has nothing to do with Ken Wilber. If you're in a position trying to bring those strands together and articulate a kind of meta vision for what's going on there, you're in a position to have to grapple with that issue. And I think ultimately where this all landed was good, because there was pushback when there was no mention of Ken Wilber in this book, because I think that makes sense that there should be some, especially in the context of talking about Hansi Freinach's work. And so you're right, I've made that change as a footnote, and so that's now the new edition if you buy that book that's in there. So I think that's a good thing to add, and I appreciate that kind of feedback. But I think that needs to be situated as part of the context, because it's sort of like, it's not just talking about, I think, what a lot of people tend to associate with the term metamodernism, which is being a kind of integral theory. It's actually this broader discourse, some of which is very adamant. And a big part of that too, in my own experience, was I was part of a panel on metamodernism at the American Academy of Religion with Storm and Linda Ciariello. And there was a visceral discomfort on Linda's part when we got to the Q&A, and one of the few questions asked was, doesn't this all have something to do with Ken Wilber? And she was like, no, not at all. Some people are using that on the internet, whatever. So it's like, oh, okay, there's that. And then, you find other people who are talking about metamodernism in the academy and in podcasts who are related to the academy. And they're like, oh, this is all just this integral stuff. And the integral theory was something in the 90s and whatever. And it's this, and so I've been witness to some of that. And so, we do just have different kind of experiential patterns that we're responding to and trying to, integrate that data, and then trying to think about how can we move these ideas forward in a way that isn't going to immediately put people off. And so I also want to name that strategic element, which you also get at, which should never, of course, supersede things like, genuine academic integrity and citation of sources and that sort of a thing. But it does need to be considered in terms of who's going to be encountering this material, and what's going to be the kind of reaction that they're going to have to these ideas if they're presented in such and such a way versus another sort of way. And if you kind of set up as, oh, metamodernism, there's a deep strand of here that's connected to Ken Wilber's integral theory, then that's going to land a certain way. And so a writer needs to be aware of those dynamics on the one hand. And to take all that very seriously, I guess. But within the context also of appreciating the very real lineages that are also informing these things. So I just want to name some of those dynamics. There was another point I wanted to throw in, but it's escaped me. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Brendan. There's I feel like quite a bit of energy, and I know it will feel quite fun for me to express it. There's a couple things, and because I'm trying to balance here. One, some small service to the conversation as others might be interested in it, and I'm also I have my own curiosities about pressing into areas of difference that I may be hearing, because otherwise I might not have such an opportunity to learn something. So I'm kind of partly hearing that there's what academia might respond to and why is somewhat of an implicit relevance here. And I think there's a lot in that. I think there's a lot of value in assessing that from a pragmatic perspective, to the degree that one remembers there's lots of young people that go through those pathways, and it's a tremendously powerful educational structure in our time. There's also relevant to that pragmatic assessment, questions about what is most important to present. There's been present some desire on behalf of some meta-modern scholars, maybe differently held, that a distancing from Ken Wilber's work is important. Could be for a number of reasons, but certainly, I've experienced what it's like anyway for some authors and thinkers I've found tremendously helpful in a very real existential and conceptual ways to not be welcome in the context of the academic institutions I studied in. I'm not talking about Ken Wilber on this point, but certainly there's many things which I've found to be valuable, and indeed which I believe are valuable, which for interesting reasons are not welcome in whatever institution. And so, speaking about all of that with a broad brush, there's value in that, but also it really matters to get into the details of it. I'm curious in that context to push towards something which another framing a little bit of the conundrum of, I don't know how to finish that sentence. What's most important to present to, because we're talking about some justifying context here that's somehow separate. And I'm always very curious about when some justification context might be having some undue influence on what is welcome to present as kind of truth, obviously, given that's kind of what we're speaking about. I'm not saying that to be too brash, but here's something that was coming through, and I've heard you speaking a little bit, Brendan. You've used the term the adjacent possible on a couple of occasions, that metamodernism is particularly concerned with, and also not too far away from that, some notion of a kind of like empirical rigor, obviously very important in the context of developmental theory, even more so. I mean, the ways that some have come to name what constitutes development as better than is always very concerning. I appreciate there's lots of conversations about this, and people get triggered and all of a sudden go on 3-hour pathways where we've got to spend like 3 hours before we can even come back to a certain place of, it's all right, bruv, okay, no one, it's all right. But nevertheless, it's important. So that is what it is. So that notion of the adjacent possible as a kind of it's interesting because we talk about an adjacent possible and we talk about that in the context of a pragmatic step. It's kind of curious because an adjacent possible opens up to potentiality in ways that, well, I mean, there's something emergent about that as well, right? So, but we definitely want to be careful about big steps we take, certainly turning a corner anywhere. One hopes to have a bit of a sensibility about what might be beyond that corner. Nevertheless, sometimes we turn the corner, it's a whole different vista. Holy shit, it turned out we're doing something different to what we thought we were doing. You know, the adjacent possible in terms of the the fruition of some novelty which changes potentially the adaptive landscape we're a part of. This is a drastic thing. And we are talking about this in the context of, you know, paradigms wanting to relate with, you know, a kind of fundamentality of truth with respect to the big picture, you know, emergentism as such, you know, really important things to consider. So on the one hand, this notion of the adjacent possible, and I want to kind of bring in what may be, and this is what I'm certainly uncertain about, but I feel it's there. I think it's there to some degree, as you know, important degree as well. So the adjacent possible here, and a certain attitude towards that, and then also perhaps what might be resisted by some in the metamodern space about the nature of integral, as sometimes represented in the context of stage theory, though let's just bench that a bit because I don't want to tie these two together too much. And that's the notion of teleology. We might think of, because we see an adjacent possible we want to take a sort of pragmatic next step, even though that opens us potentially in a massive way. And so like there's already a little bit of generative tension there, not like some bullshit tension, like a generative tension with respect to presencing those two. When we think about telos and teleology, and this is often what can be used in a deeply concerning way to justify the kind of hierarchies then associated with various spaces for spiritual development and religious formation. Turns out a couple of us, we kind of know where we're going. We know the real end here, and we're going to judge you in relation to that. And by the way you get there is through this interior type process, mediated intersubjectively. Maybe it involves sex, power, various things, a whole bunch of beliefs. Now, to make this even more fun, if you'll allow me, we live in a world, particularly in the context of the digital. It's always been there, you know. Of course, integral and metamodern have different labels for these types of things. You want to call various types of mythological thinking. I don't even necessarily want to label it. Let's be more blunt. Let's talk about people like Alex Jones. Okay, let's talk about people like Alex Jones. Super relevant, influence of millions of people, maybe far more influential, is likely to be far more influential in swaying the next election than anybody in the metamodern integral theory space. This is very serious from every level of politics, but also massively to the influence on the affectivity of the imagistic, spiritual, mytho-poetic narrative structure of millions of people, okay, in a serious way. Into there, you have a tremendously, God, I'm so fucking English, fecund, I disappoint myself sometimes. Jesus.
Fecund is a great word. I'm glad to hear that.
Haven't used it in years, maybe ever, but there it is. It's come out. It's a ridiculously fecund, libidinal context for inquiry associated with such things as DMT, psychedelics, and the kind of intersubjective experiences which are then somehow in the justification space for justifying, you know, very, one could say, kind of postmodern versions of Christianity. I mean, there's a whole conspirituality stuff. Like I could give a lot of color to this. Obviously, we only have so much time. There's good reason, I think, for bringing in these kinds of threads, right? Because I tell you what academia is super scared of. Not scared of, all right? They would never admit to being scared, but in some important sense, there's a tremendous what academia detests, let's say, is is like the epistemic credibility of Alex Jones, right? Okay, but extremely influential, okay, and in a number of important ways. There's a profound telos put forward in a number of these, in just that maelstrom, in that cauldron, and I I do tend to detect a tremendous, there's something rightly concern for an overbearing, strong arming of telos, but it does seem to me, and maybe this is something I know you can speak to this in an interesting way, Bruce, and Brendan, we know each other a little less, and I know that metamodernism, particularly in the work of Hansi and what have you, is very much seeking as well to speak to the different modes of consciousness and identity with the world that can be cultivated and what have you. But there's, in both cases, and I wouldn't say this is something that I would put that academia is particularly allergic to in the context of integral theory, there are claims made as to, and of course many spiritual traditions, right? There are claims made to the let's say there are fewer people in quantitative terms that realize certain states and modes of identity, connection with others, perspectives of the world, and it, in such states, in such modes, even if we were to bring in the whole world of dreaming, and relating with the contents of the unconscious and image, there are, it seems to me, rarefied, more esoteric modes of relating with Jesus. It's kind of like, it's like they're almost like dialogical partners for justification. That might be one kind of, that's one way, a certain rational framing I'm trying to bring. There are experiences, there are encounters, there are modes of perception of pattern and treatment of reality that is very disjunctive, much more fluid, much richer than what I at least remember as a particular kind of sterile world of academia. I haven't done the best job at this. I'm saying this with an invitation for like another 4-hour conversation around a fireplace. Do you know what I mean? Because there's so much here. There's whole lives of interest in this, right? I'm trying to open into some stuff I genuinely think is very interesting. And I hope that was at least interesting to bring in some context. Let's see what we can do in sort of 15 minutes or so, and then we'll invite people to turn on their cameras then. But I saw you nodding along, Bruce, and I'm curious what you're picking up on. I am in there trying to identify, potentially, is this something that is a bit of we can say it can be a generative tension point between metamodernism and a certain disposition toward relating with telos. I haven't linked it all together fantastically, but anyway, Bruce, so you were nodding along at times. So that's at least somewhat gratifying for me, encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. There's so much in there. I'd love to have an excuse to come down under and hang out. One part that I was laughing at is speaking about the influence of Alex Jones and the outsized influence of someone like him, who is a kind of shamanic figure, who can cast a spell over a culture. But I was thinking about a recent happening within the integral world where a guy who calls himself Ho-Math, Ho short for whore or woman, who calls himself Ho-Math, has been putting out videos on how to pick up women and how to read signals and all that stuff for a bunch of frustrated young males. And he's been using integral language, and he's been getting, within 3 weeks, 1 million views and picking up 500,000, members within a short period of time. Whereas a friend of mine working in Integral Life has put in a decade or more of labor into very finely created videos that are just barely getting a blip compared to what Ho-Math is generating, right? And so we've been vexed and shaking our heads and amused and frustrated and appreciating all of the well-meaning but non-shamanic in a sense presentation of integral stuff, or non-mimetic, plugging into the cultural memes. And so there is something to be said for finding a voice outside of academia. Academia does put a lot of strictures around you. So there's some value in getting some academic credibility, but there's also value in stepping outside of those bounds and trying to, from my side, I've tried to navigate both sides of that, to write academic papers and then to create art and to do podcasts and things like that. But it's not easy to walk both of those lines. And in my own context now at my university, it's gotten to the point where I actually have to be pretty conscious of what I'm putting on video because it's going to circulate in the halls of academia. And it's not an easy dance to follow. I think that whole point about, there's a place I wanted to go with that, with consciousness and dreaming, and maybe the difference between metamodern and integral telos. I think just to say one thing about integral, I think there are excessive claims within integral. And sometimes Wilber's religion gets mixed up with the academic part in a way that becomes problematic for a lot of circles. At the same time, I also feel like some of what is called woo by some metamodernists or other people within the integral community is actually a saying yes to at least a taking seriously of some of the deepest contemplative experiences and human consciousness unfoldment potentials that have been articulated in the great world traditions, the multiple esoteric traditions where they have intensive practices and self-transformative practices and, a very rich cartography of human consciousness potentials and a very rich, I've studied very deeply in the Bonpo and Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist Tantra traditions and multiple others. And it's super rich and very profound. And there's a lot of stuff there that I feel like I've experienced in some of the more cautious metamodern conversations that gets lumped together with more new agey or less grounded kinds of things as all woo. And I think there is a value in integral acknowledging what these traditions have done and the work that they do, and not only to look towards imaginal storytelling, ritual kind of products, but a fuller range of what's available in human consciousness development. These things are kept esoteric for a reason, because when they are floated in the public too much, they get misunderstood, they get misapplied, they become poisonous, right? So there's legitimate criticism of too easy inflation and fetishizing of those things. But I think there's value in integral making room for that in a robust way that I haven't experienced as much in metamodernism.
Yeah, those are great points that I'd love the opportunity to speak to, because I see a lot of confusion in a lot of speaking past each other, I think, in some of the integral metamodern conversation. So I'll try to speak to everything that's there, first starting with the academia bit, because I think that's important too, and then getting to the woo debate. I think maybe we shouldn't give Alex Jones too much credit and label him shamanic. I think that if we're developmentally informed, we're aware that it becomes increasingly rare to be working with more and more complex thought, and that there's going to be a kind of a greater numbers of people who are working in less complex domains of cognition, for whom more assimilatory and mythic forms of sense making are particularly resonant. And so it makes sense to me that the Alex Joneses of the world are going to have millions of followers, and the Homaths of the world are going to have millions of followers, and people doing very intellectually deep and profound sorts of work online are not going to get the same levels of engagement. But that makes a lot of sense if you're familiar with developmental theories. So I don't think we should say, you know, oh, there's some secret sauce in whatever Alex Jones is doing. You know, for what it's worth. But I just wanted to say that. As for the academic part, though, this is also something that requires some parsing and some teasing apart. And I want to at first come out by saying I am no fan of academia, right? I've tried it multiple times and each time have made the life decision to remove myself from it. I think it's profoundly, I don't want to say toxic, but it's sort of there's a careerist nonsense about it that's become hijacked by ideology, and the whole doddering institution of higher education is just as broken as many of the institutions that we face in our political sphere and all over the country, if not the world, in sort of this, you know, developed Western world that's sort of dealing with this imminent sort of collapse, basically. So I sing no praises of academe. On the one hand, and I want to make that clear because I can see the potential for people to frame this sort of metamodern, or at least personally, a penchant to trying to infiltrate existing institutions with metamodern thought as sort of a kowtowing to this, the holy academe and the beautiful scholars who know all things, that we should have to, you know, eschew transcendental truths in order to make the academics happy. It's like, no, there's none of that. So I want to make that clear too. But what I do think that there is still continued value in these institutions that have been around now for hundreds of years, and we should appreciate the complexity that we accumulate over time, and we shouldn't just sort of be like, you know, radical revolutionaries and try to just, you know, run it all down and throw it out all the babies with the bathwater. So there is something meaningful happening inside of academia too, and it is, to Tim's point, it is this profound epicenter of, you know, it's the pedagogical infrastructure for our civilization, and so we should take that seriously, both from a pragmatic element in terms of like, yes, millions of people move through the system and get indoctrinated through it, but also from like a kind of philosophical, epistemological lens, and that there are legitimate reasons why people doing hard science have credibility, right? If you can show your work and show your evidence and you do the methodological work that needs to be done to make your claim, and it's reproducible and all this, like the institution of science in a small s, you know, that isn't just scientism, it isn't just a bunch of people, you know, patting themselves on the back, saying things in academic fields. That's really profoundly meaningful, and we should take that very seriously. Something like integral theory clearly is trying to integrate the best of modern science and all these developmental theories that it's given us, and the work of Piaget and Commons and all these other people, right? So like, there's an implicit notion that like scientific knowledge has this profound importance, and we should take that seriously. So within the broken institution of academia, there are remnants of genuine epistemological rigor, and we should care for that. And so within that, I see a profound opportunity for a paradigm change, right? That right now, a huge part of the reason why the academic institutions are failing is because they're, you know, largely permeated by a kind of postmodern ideology, more so in the human sciences than in the, you know, other sciences. But still, there's this auto-critique, and there's this relentless sort of critical engagement that's led to a kind of paralysis. And I don't need to rehearse all of those arguments, but like, there's a big reason why all that's failing, right? And so we're on the cusp of a paradigm shift, and people are they're hungry for a kind of postmodern thing to be the next stage, right? Now, if you have something there that could get us more towards a kind of integral vision, then that's great. But if you just try to hand people integral theory and say, yes, social scientists, the thing that we need to do now is go meditate and find the face that existed before the Big Bang, it's like, that's not probably going to work, right? But if you have a paradigm that is deeply grounded in a kind of philosophical rigor, like the kind of work that Jason Storm is doing on the one hand, right? And then you've also got this stuff happening in cultural studies and people in academia talking about art and all that, then you're starting to see this edifice emerge that could begin to be the foundations for a real paradigm shift that could actually implement some meaningful ideological shifts in the academy that could help that could help, you know? And so I think we should foster that. We should cultivate it. We should take it very seriously. And as much as we might want to jump to more extreme, outcomes and more future oriented perspectives, we've got to work with what we've got. And I think that this could be valuable. So I want to make that point. I also want to say that, like, there's a lot in integral theory that has nothing to do with religion that's just profoundly insightful. But it's in other traditions too. But like the developmental lens on cultural evolution is an incredibly powerful tool that makes so much sense. And yet, there's not really a way for it to enter the academy in its present state. Now, you've had people like Habermas do this sort of stuff, and you've had, various thinkers here and there engage it, Piaget engaged to some degree, but for a large part, it's not there. I just feel like that could be so powerful. And if people feel like in order to bring that in, you've got to bring everything along with integral theory with it, and this quadrant model and the inner outer and this panpsychism and this teleology and all this stuff and the eros, it's just too much to swallow. But if we could work with something that's just developmental theories of cultural evolution, we could do that with academic rigor and with some real solid evidence that could like begin to persuade people in the academy and again affect a kind of real paradigm shift. So I see metamodernism as working towards doing some of that stuff. And I think that we need to have a very nuanced notion of what role the academy plays in all of this conversation, in all the ways that I've said that it's both terrible, it's also, it is what it is, and we have to work with it. And we also want to move beyond it, and et cetera. And then real quickly on the last point there, which all relates to this in some ways, is the woo question, which is probably maybe would be probably the biggest sticking point in this conversation if we had more time to really dig into it. But I think in a similar way, there's that next step that's possible, and we can have all these things together in a way that could, I think, have some real legs to it. If I would posit Bobby Azarian's work is an incredible example of this, right? You read his book, The Romance of Reality, and he's talking about complexification leading to the emergence of this global mind and this cultural evolution bit that's a part of it, and this thermodynamic stuff that leads to greater and greater negative entropy and all this stuff. And there's this teleological vision, to bring it back, Tim, to your question around teleology. There's this profound teleological vision where he's like bringing in Teilhard de Chardin and all this other stuff, right? And the cover of the book has a blurb by Michael Shermer, the skeptic, right? He's the editor of Skeptic magazine. He's always been like the go-to like skeptic guy, right? He's like, this is a great book, That was amazing to me. The fact that we could make those kinds of bridges possible is really encouraging, that we're starting to maybe move into a different way of talking about these ideas that could be palatable across divides and polarities, right? And potentially, again, reach into the institutions. Carl Friston liked his book, and Michael Levins is interested in this stuff, right? So like we are seeing this paradigm shift. There's a value in not getting too much ahead of ourselves, and I think there's an incredible value that metamodernism could be a part of here in trying to make these bridges, these more immediate adjacent possible bridges. And in the background, yes, people who want to go further, right? There are integral maps, and there are other kind of more advanced kind of meta-theoretical and spiritually informed visions of reality. And like, the more the better, that's great. But in terms of trying to go to that next step, I think that metamodernism...
Sound cut out.
Sorry. I was going to say, the last thing I was going to say is that, at least conceptually, like, I don't think that there is this really profound difference between what we're talking about is woo, right? And how would I say this? I guess when Bruce was talking, he made the suggestion that in metamodern context, there's this notion that mystical and contemplative traditions just get lumped into the woo camp. And I don't think that's quite right. I think that there's a lot of concern to be very clear about what is pre-rational and what's not. But I think that there's room in a metamodern vision. In fact, it's built into the whole perspective that there is mystery, that there is a paradigm beyond the current paradigm, and there's a paradigm beyond that, and a paradigm beyond that. And we're going to be integrating new information as we learn more. So I think that it needs to be accepted as a given that there are currently things in the world that we experience that we don't have a good accounting for. And I don't want to give the impression in my work, which maybe sometimes I do, that metamodernism only cares about the science, right? We need to take seriously that, like, we don't know so much and we're going to learn so much. But when we do, it's going to become naturalized. It's going to become reality. It's going to become scientific because we'll know the causal mechanisms that exist to it, right? And so I want to make that point because there's a profound difference in my mind between woo as sort of a pre-rational, oh, I have an intention and I manifest things in the world, or I use crystals and I heal myself or something, versus, I engage in a profound meditational contemplative practice and I experience oneness with the divine. Like, these are very different things. And it would just be a shame if metamodernism was conflated with a conflation around that, which I don't think is there. So anyway, that's my I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I have two very brief things to say as we open it up to the whole group. One is, of course, the pre-trans fallacy of Wilbur is exactly around that is the concern, is that we need to make those kind of differentiations carefully. And two, just in terms of the existing, scholarship, if you do look at the multiple journals and academic publications and all of that, there's already an extremely graded and telescopic application of integral thought to many different fields that do not involve having to swallow that whole enchilada and the whole, I am before the Big Bang. There's a whole range of ways that is explored and applied that, I think show the kind of sensitivity for context that you're talking about there. But yeah, wish we had a fire and another 4 hours.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you both. Hey, thank you both. I really appreciate that. And I think that in what we've discussed so far, I think there's contours for what would be an ongoing conversation already fairly well trod. And that's, I think, valuable for those who, at least some of those who'll be listening along, even if there's plenty more to flesh out in relation to all of that. I do have a sense of where you're coming from, Brendan, and I think that's an important orientation to speak for in and among a number of orientations, which I also hear you very much call into conversation, i.e. there's plenty more to explore. It's what's pragmatically a good idea. At the end of the day, we try stuff, don't we? And we got to try stuff out. And in that sense that you mentioned earlier, Bruce, of, a thousand seeds coming to bloom, or however that expression was, there's definitely something very critical about that. And it's so interesting watching the different parts of yourself that are evoked in certain contexts for dialogue, because depending in the context, I can be more or less on the hold up, let's go a little bit more carefully. And in some other ones, it's like there's like a territories unfolded before me where I get to like run around like some sort of happy being and be like, nah, hold on a second, let me bring some stuff in. And it's always a pleasure to share some of that energy as well. And there's plenty more there. So with that, thank you both. I'll invite everybody else, if you would like to join us. You don't have to, but you're more than welcome to in this just final little part here. We ended up speaking a little longer than initially intended, but it just seemed like there was some stuff to move through, and I'm glad we did. So Tom, Zach, Kyle, Mr. OG, thank you. Yeah, well, here we are then. I did decide that I can't stick around too long today because I actually have I had to make another appointment not too long, Elo Aspasia, not too long after this. So Tom's got the co-host down. So once we do bring this to a close, certainly invite you guys to stick around, and maybe even if you want, Tom, to record it and we could share that as well, potentially with the network. I'd be definitely curious, and the invitation would be, Bruce, Brendan, very much. We'll bring it to a close when we do, and then you're welcome to stick around as well. But hey, how about we open to the silence? We've only got a short amount of time before I want to give everybody the opportunity to bow out. And so, knowing you as I do, it's like, Mr. OG's gonna open this up to a 10-hour conversation. So, Jesus Christ. Thank God we talked to him so late at night over there. Otherwise, I don't know what we'd do. Just the whole day. So we just open it to the silence. I'm very curious to welcome any reflections, really any sharing of voice at all to anyone about anything.
Yes, I'm appreciating the fire.
I've got something. It's quite big, and so this is more of just an open-ended invitation. So it seems like with the New Age, they're really nailing the aesthetic component of the mythos, and even something about the metaphysics is like very vital. And when we talk about like the Homath and Alex Jones, they seem to be doing a similar move where at the aesthetic level, there is like something very compelling and exciting. But at the same time, there is this pre-trans risk, and it seems like that risk becomes most pronounced when we are working more with the imaginary, with the aesthetic, because there's that ambiguity at play. And I see people like Gaffney with, say, cosmoerotic humanism, where he is really applying this rigor to something that does feel like it has potentially that kind of intensity. I feel like there's still a lot there that's unknown in terms of what form that will take. But I'm just curious how we all feel about taking something like metamodernism and the rigor that is being applied there and bringing that into conversation with parts of the New Age that are more open to that. We've actually got a conversation coming up here where we're going to discuss dialogue on the Aubrey Marcus podcast that's quite deep in that direction. And so this is a very alive topic for us collectively. But yeah, he appears to be someone who he's in conversation with Gaffney, I believe, and other people, John Churchill, all of these kind of integral people. And there does seem to be an openness there, but at the same time, for me, there is this real ambiguity around the pre-trans positioning, where in one moment, I really feel like they're inhabiting the edges of human potential in their vision. But then in the next moment, I feel like there's a coming forth of a kind of identity-based drive. And I don't want any of this to be too critical. I'm more just very curious about this and how we see metamodernism potentially tapping into that vitality of the like deep aesthetic and archetypal realm.
Well, so it's interesting. Maybe I'll just say this, like there's a constellation, right? There's a constellation here, and you could make a meaningful concept map between like Jonathan Pageau over here and Jordan Peterson and Alex Jones, but then Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, and then John Vervaeke, Greg Enriquez, me, Metamodernism over here, right, and it's sort of a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon sort of a thing. At a certain point, you can draw connections, but I guess I would put it this well. All right, I also don't want to be too critical either, so I want to be as expansive as possible. But there's an enmeshment between these mimetic conversations, you could say. But at the same time, I feel like it's sort of like a light that tapers off as you move further away from it. and that you could imagine these different nodes as having these sort of like epicenters of light that kind of reach out. And so some people might be on the edge of one and on the edge of another, so they can kind of, you know, bridge between. So maybe it'd be easier for people to hop over from like a Alex Jones into a Jonathan Peugeot, or a Jonathan Peugeot to a Jordan Peterson, et cetera, right? But then it becomes harder for like other of these nodes to connect to each other. You can almost think about this as like a circle of fifths, and sort of like they all connect, but one might be diametrically on the other side of the circle than the other. So in a kind of expansive way, there's something like that going on, I would say. For my part, as someone, for example, who moderates a Metamodernism Facebook group, I would say that if people showed up to that space posting a lot of, say, Alex Jones content, I would probably say this probably isn't the right space for you. You know, like you might be, and there are many other spaces on the internet for this kind of content. Or the whole math thing was actually another good example, right? Like someone showed up and posted that, and I took it down. And I was like, this isn't where this belongs, because this is more immediately adjacent to kind of an incel, you know, a frustrated male youth demographic, and that's not really what's going on in this space. And I'm very comfortable making those kinds of distinctions, because also I've seen what happens in communities where you try to be too open and the boundaries are too porous, and then you wind up the whole thing implodes. So I think it's important to be intentional about that. And so I guess, yeah, that would be my answer to that, is I think that there are varying degrees of sophistication in which people engage the archetypal. And I think that, you know, Peugeot is doing fascinating stuff. It's not my cup of tea, but there's some stuff there. I'm more of a kind of Jean Vervaeke stuff, and people can be doing some Jungian stuff, and that's fascinating. But like, but you can also quickly see where that starts to shade into kind of this netherworldly region of concepts that do then become very pre-rational and start opening up to a whole sort of content that, for me, I feel like this doesn't have any germane application to a kind of at least rational sort of concept mimetic space. So it's sort of like, yeah, it's not the same thing. So that would be my answer. And maybe that, I don't know, I'm not actually familiar enough with the folks here or the broader community to know if that kind of a response is going to land in a frustrated way or not. But that would be just what I would say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brendan. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly hold very much the sensibility here of relating with a breadth and depth of perspective, and holding to a rigor of relation to that. You know, certainly there's so much there. There is, it's so interesting. It's so much of these conversations, that last comment you just made, Brendan, you know, wondering about how that would be met or received by those you're speaking to. So much of our very inquiry, our shared inquiry into the nature of this subject matter, is oriented and in some sense is constrained by the discourse to which we're speaking into. And I'm noting that to just make the link to recognizing something I take to be profoundly critical in meeting people where they are. Whether it's a family member who might have, as they'd articulated, very different metaphysical positions to me. But what is a metaphysical position when you are here relating with your existential coherence as named through your connection to God? There is a quality of meeting and affirming, in that sense, the dignity of the reality of experience, which is, for me, critical. There's an energetic meeting there, and it's lovely to have you, Aspasia. And it's such an interesting prospect for the kind of shamanic, the meta shamanic of our time. You know, it's I just know so many people who undergo the kind of visionary reality that you'd associate very much with at least how the intellect would read it. In terms of almost to depict their experiences, you'd associate that very much, You could have on the one hand Messiah, on the other hand schizotypal mental illness. Now that, even to say that, is going to be sacrilege depending on what discourse that's spoken into. And so there's something of this tremendous tension in even, and you know, you've made this move a couple times, Bruce, as well. I think before we stepped into presencing, you know, some of the more pointed places where there might be some difference, there is this, well, hang on a second, we're all involved and deeply invested in some sense in a kind of friendship and mode of communication, and based on a kind of trust that in some sense is almost, I'm going to say prior, more fundamental. It's at least as much along for the ride as conceptual disagreement. And that's, I'm kind of just like circling on that in a meta way and saying that that as a thing is one of the things I'm trying to hold open to, but to hold open as well to the criticality of relating energetically before conceptual judgment, while at the same time holding to a certain, like a criticality of like boundary at the same time. It's, there's a certain kind of transrational ongoing mode to meet a lot of this with, and if there isn't in presence the holding to like real like dignity, the other's existential identitarian connection to mythic grounding, then I wonder how much it's possible to actually engage in, you know, integrative pluralism at all. But I'm saying that not as an intellectual point, but as like a radical point, and the kind of context that might be necessary to support that. And so in that sense, my perspective is like very much affirming what I'm hearing as the kind of metamodern holding to rigor, and at the same time it feels like in some sense to meet the energetic intensity of our time, there does indeed have to be this holding open as well to the criticality of experience in the way I'm trying to name, because it, you know, it just overflows all over the place, you know, it overflows. Anyway, I know that last thing I said didn't make sense at all, but fuck it.
Can I piggyback off that real quick, Tim? And
Go
try
ahead,
to
Christian.
pull it into maybe, hopefully, the similar direction, but maybe a little bit elsewhere. And also, Brendan and Bruce, good to see you not on Facebook and in person after a lot of Facebook interactions. So like this kind of immediacy that I think I heard you speaking to, Tim, that informs how we relate to each other in a transrational way that can't really be bridged with a bunch of conceptual communication necessarily. I wonder how important it is to start building those bridges, and on what kinds of timelines. And so this is a somewhat socio-political and futurist question about the state of things, and you know, our kind of gut sense of the urgency with which we need to kind of address a lot of the problems that metamodernism wants to address, and that Integral wants to talk about, if I can make a slight distinction between the two in that way, although it's not a perfect distinction. And so when we talk about, and I'll hold that, which is this question of what's the sense of urgency that people feel, in this case, you, Brendan, and Bruce, about the projects of Integral and Metamodernism in addressing our situation, the human situation, the global situation, metacrisis, whatever. Does it feel like, oh gosh, we really got to get snappy with this, or is it fast, like, you know, let's just steady the course, or we don't know, or whatever? Maybe there's some other principle altogether that kind of guides your sense of urgency there. So there's that question. And then there's the question that's also been discussed a lot, which is this kind of associative social aspect of how it is integral or metamodernism or whatever understood in its association with other public figures, some of whom may be kind of radioactive in certain ways. And then also, how do those two speak to each other, right? So like when, on the one hand, like when might integral need to, or people who are like, let's say, a part of the integral conversation want to say like, look, there's the baggage of linking things to integral, maybe not so much in academia, but let's say in a broader social context, is maybe too heavy to meet the kinds of problems we're facing with the speed that we need to meet them with. Is that even a legitimate question? Is, in order to get to the shore, do we have to throw a few things overboard, even though they're precious to us, and it's not within our traditional, not within our sentiments about tradition to throw those things overboard? That's like a big question, and I'm not making an assumption on the other side of it. I'm just holding it open. On the other hand, like maybe on the more metamodernism side of this, is there like a way in which you have to, use the tools of the devil here, like learn something from Homath, learn something from Alex Jones, even in helping to get these ideas out there, but although, making an assumption here that you need to have some type of direct interface with the general public, maybe there's a different strategy, which is kind of this like mycelial, well, we're just going to focus on academia, or this group of thinkers or policymakers, or just kind of get to these nice key points, and that's where our work needs to happen. Or does there need to be this kind of, mass introduction to some extent of metamodernism and integral to the general public, and then how do you navigate that? So maybe three different questions there: urgency,
yeah, Jesus, there's a lot.
Association problems, and how you kind of weight what's important and what needs to be thrown out or left behind, and then the need to interface with the public versus other, let's say, pockets of society.
Okay, let me jump in real quick. Thank you for that, Christian. Let's
Too big of a question?
Well, we'll just,
Great
in
questions.
terms of, we'll open up to Bruce and Brendan just to invite you to share maybe in response to that and some closing thoughts, and then we'll bring it to a close, and we'll let people stay on, and Tom continue recording that. Just then, before we do, there's one thing Daniel Schmachtenberger and Alex Jones have in common, and that's they both sell supplements. And that's a very interesting point to make, genuinely speaking, and it's a partial response to one of those questions. But yeah, just some closing thoughts in response to Christian there, Brendan and Bruce. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot, and it could be a very big answer. I think a short, rounded answer would be, at least for me personally, I think there are ways that the integral discourse and model works, and there are others that it doesn't. And so I work in multiple areas at the same time. I do feel a great deal of urgency. I do feel that there's value in putting energy into integral work, and I continue to do it. But I'm also working outside of that in different ways, because I think because of the urgency, we can't just take one approach. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. We really need to reach, we need to, offer whatever we can offer in whatever channels work. And I would say, in terms of, my own experience of like where integral works and doesn't work, might be a little different than some people seeing it. And that because I teach it, and sometimes I teach it in very hot postmodern contexts. And, just a few days ago, I got a letter, which is actually typical of letters that I've gotten over a number of years. But this person wrote to me saying that they were angry person about, racial injustice and social injustice, and they were strongly, against patriarchy and all kinds of things, and they had been really fighting, for a long time. And after this course, they had come to see things very, very differently, and they were resituating themselves in an understanding of an unfolding of values and perspectives, and seeing where they were cutting off what had come before and finding a new way to fold those in and work more fruitfully across communities. And so, in other words, she was saying that integral theory had helped her see herself and her own work and her relationship to society, including the way that she had become enclosed on herself in a certain kind of resistant way, she'd unfolded. And, I've gotten many, many letters from students like that. So you would think integral is anathema to that crowd. And it's actually, in my experience, I've had many activists write to me and say they're now finding new ways to work in society. So for me, that's a rewarding thing. And it shows to me that this is not necessarily getting in the way of making a positive impact. In terms of interfacing with, different kinds of people in charge, people in communities, there's definitely risk, and especially if you're in an established position as I am, in some places it's risky to do that. But overall, I think it's valuable, and we need to do that. We need to, go where the energy is in some sense and see how we can roll with it and how we can surf with it. And I think get over some of our own prejudices. I know I've had experiences of talking to people that I just would have immediately dismissed as New Age. And as you get into really the nuances of what your concerns are and what their concerns are, there's actually a lot more overlap than you would expect. There's a lot more insight, at least I've experienced from friends. I followed the harmonic convergence back in the 80s out to Sedona with my mother in the whole big New Age mecca of Sedona and all, so I was right there on the ground floor of the whole birth of New Age stuff in Sedona. And I saw a lot of nonsense, a lot of ridiculous stuff, but there's some really beautiful stuff. And it has, you can definitely say, stronger cultural currency than anything that Metamodernism or Integral has achieved. And there's something to look at there. So I think that's that point. One of the things I'm doing, I'm working in a leadership program now, and that's one of the strategies is we're not teaching integral theory, we're not teaching metamodernism, but we're dealing with all kinds of things that are important to those communities, and we're trying to work with people in Silicon Valley and people who are in leadership positions around the world, and in change agent and creative artist. To me, that's like one front at which work can be done. And so that's like one of my major projects right now.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. And first I would also say, like, a lot of this conversation has been around metamodernism versus integral, but at the same time, like, these are kin communities, adjacent communities. If there was one thing that I would love for, if one thing could happen and just a copy of sex ecology, spirituality, or integral psychology ended up in the hands of every single person on the planet, like, that would be incredible. Like, so it's a lover's quarrel, I guess is what I want to say, just to contextualize some of this, that for the broader conversation around this. And we're really, working across purposes? No, the opposite of across purposes. Working in the same direction. But I think your questions are great, and they're very important. Briefly, again, because there's not much time, I would just say I think that we have to acknowledge, the way that I look at it, I'll put it that way, is we have to acknowledge the systemic nature of the problems that we face. And so I think that can be very hard to grapple with, actually psychologically, because we often, we're used to seeing a problem and then being able to go fix it. Most of the things that we consider as problems, it's like, oh, the door is broken, or maybe it's, oh, there's a problem in my community, right? But that's not the kind of problems that we face. We face systematic problems at a global level, and it's like, what do you do about that? And so I think we have to acknowledge that there's an individual and a collective component to that working simultaneously, that we have to do everything that we can with a profound urgency as individuals, but we also have to be able to simultaneously take an almost kind of Taoist approach and be like, this is going to unfold the way it unfolds, and to give ourselves grace, and to also just acknowledge that, like, the agential aspects of the meta crisis are not in any individual's power. And we can try to influence it, we can try to steer, we can try to find points of leverage, but there's a kind of letting go that has to also happen at an individual level to just be okay with, like, things are going to unfold and that is the reality. So I think simultaneously doing that is very hard, because we both should be individually incredibly urgently invested in trying to do all that we can, but also recognizing that this is playing out across a kind of emergent level with billions of people involved. But I think Bruce is absolutely right about working on multiple fronts. And again, to dispel any kind of confusion, I don't think academia is the solution to this problem, but it's also not necessarily the impediment to the solution either, right? So we need multiple fronts. We need an all of the above strategy to attack this. And I think if we were all doing multiple things at multiple levels, at multiple scales, that's sort of the best way of going about it. So, like, yes, I've been involved in setting up academic journals because I want to see these ideas come into the institutions, right? But I'm also not in that world. I'm outside of academia. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Facebook, and I'm trying to engage people that way. I'm writing books. I run a retreat center. I'm trying to have in-person and online things happening. I'm trying to get ideas out into the world, but I'm also trying to cultivate, individual interpersonal dynamics at an intimate level. So we just need to do the whole thing, and that places incredible demands on people. But that's kind of the nature of it, I suppose. So yeah, I guess that's all I'll say briefly. And it's a really important topic, and we could spend a whole weekend going into that issue. But I think that's enough for now.
Thank you. All right. Well, let's bring it to a close here, and I will stick around for just a little bit for those who would like to hang about. But thank you so much. I look forward to the next opportunity, hopefully before too long. And yeah, until next time.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us, Tim, and you have such a sensitive and beautiful way of holding space. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming out, and appreciate it. And I'm also very happy to continue conversations whenever. Just reach out to me, and I like doing Zoom calls with people too. So I'm very happy to chat whenever.
Nice one. All right. If no one wants to leave, that's the thing. Do you know what I mean? I think it's me. I think I'm the one that wants to leave. Well, I say I like to give people, try and stay more or less close to the times we agree on. But there's a lot more here. So can I just double check, Tom, if you're actually down to hang around, like what your next kind of hour is looking like?
Yeah, I can hang around for sure. Wants to stay and chat.
Okay. There's always something magic about when the person who invited the thing and is, hosting it in that sense, like, negates themselves. It is profoundly generative, shocking, sadly, in a way. It's more generative than actually fucking being there, but it is what it is. All right. I will then wish you all very well, and if it stops recording, Tom, can you hit recording and maybe do it on gallery mode? If you do, that'd be good. Just, it's much better, in my opinion. But hopefully the cloud continues. All right then. Much love, everybody. I look forward to listening to what comes next, and maybe we'll share it publicly. So just maybe keep that in mind in terms of, personas holding together like normal people. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I guess there's still like a thread there that I'm feeling, so maybe I can just throw that out there.